All right, so we're going to get started. You guys got a handout today that is your exercise 104. And this is going to kind of be the track that we'll be in for a while, where we'll do a couple days working in Rhino, learning how to model things in Rhino, and then we'll take a step back and we'll go into V-Ray and we'll learn how to do some V-Ray stuff. So V-Ray, today's your first real day in V-Ray. We won't spend much time at all in Rhino. Most of it will be related to V-Ray and or materials. And you'll get your first taste of how complicated V-Ray can be and how many options there can be. What I've done is to try to distill out, this is the most important stuff that you need to know, and so concentrate on these things and ignore all the rest of the options. But the truth is there's a lot of options, and that's because V-Ray is one of the most photorealistic rendering engines that are out there. V-Ray does, just as a reminder, work for a bunch of different software programs. So if you learn V-Ray right now, you'll be good in V-Ray for SketchUp, for example. Not that you would ever model in SketchUp after my class. You could work in 3D Studio Max and use V-Ray. You can work in, I think, Cinema 4D has a V-Ray plugin. I mean, there's a variety of software that has V-Ray. So once you learn V-Ray, you can kind of stick with it. The one other thing that I want to point out is, much to my grumbling and complaining and everything else that I could possibly do, we are still on V-Ray 1.5. If you find a V-Ray version that you're using at home, for example, not that I recommend doing that, you will probably be in V-Ray 3. All of the stuff is still there, but they did a major reorganization of stuff. So if you go to open it, it's going to look different. And so just be aware that if you're going to your work and they have V-Ray and you open it up and you're like, wait a minute, it looks totally different. It's because we're still on V-Ray 1.5 because they don't want to pay to upgrade. So, yeah. So anyway, maybe someday soon I'll convince them that it's necessary. But for right now, we're stuck. So today we're going to get into V-Ray. There are a few issues relating to V-Ray that we're going to start with dealing with. The first off, the toolbars that work in V-Ray weren't loaded correctly on your machines when you go to open Rhino. So we need to download those toolbars, save them on your flash drive, and then be able to load them. So I'm going to walk you through that part today. In exercise 204 here, at the bottom, there's a couple things to download. The first one is the computer setup files. This includes your V-Ray toolbar, which is what we need right now. It will download quickly. I'll go ahead and click on it to start the download. You can see that it downloads almost instantaneously. It's a zip file, so I need to actually extract that zip file. And there are two things in it. One is the V-Ray for Rhino toolbar. The other is something called the Section Tools installer, which did actually install correctly. I put these two together because I didn't have faith that both would install correctly. But I got one of two, so I'm batting 500 for this semester. Anyway, the V-Ray toolbar is there. I need you to copy that V-Ray toolbar onto your flash drive. Since it didn't load automatically on your computers, we want to make sure that it gets someplace where you can reload it. And so I would recommend putting it in some kind of a folder on your flash drive. Paste. There we go. So that you can go back and look at it. It is the V-Ray for Rhino v4_TB. So I have that on my flash drive. Now, the other thing that I have for you to download today is a little bit further down here. It's download V-Ray material library for your flash drive. There is on the course website a interactive material library where you can actually go and look at what people have done in various materials, and you can pick certain types of materials, etc. All the materials in that material library that have the Digital Tools logo on them are ones that I've worked on and made sure that they actually work for you and have the right parts to them. So I can verify. Basically, I've verified those. Some of which are there, some of which are not. Doesn't mean that the other ones might not work. They might work just fine. But I like to point that out. All of those ones, or at least most of them, should be included in this downloadable library for you. So if we click on that downloadable library, it will actually take you to the resources page. You're looking under Archie 136 and download zip archive of V-Ray materials. That's what you want, and we'll need that today. So you can go ahead and start that process. If you click on it, I believe it takes you to a Dropbox page. You don't have to sign up for Dropbox. You can just close that and say, yes, I want to download it. I forget how you do that. Somehow you're supposed to be able to download it. Maybe I'm already, oh, there it is, download. See, direct download. Perfect. And we'll download it. It's 120 megabytes, so it'll take a little while. You don't need it right away today, but if you started downloading now, a little bit later on, it'll be valuable for you. It is a zip file, so we'll have to extract that zip file and put it somewhere on your flash drive where it will exist from now on. OK, so we're going to go ahead, now that I've started those two things downloading, we're going to go ahead and open up Rhino. So we'll get this started. And I'm always going to pick this large object inches for the scale that I'm working in and the units that I'm working in. And we'll go ahead and let that load up. Perfect. So it's loaded up. I can click on the Standard tab to change to my standard tools. But like I said, the V-Ray Toolbars didn't load. And so this is something that you're going to get in the habit of doing, where you're going to have to reload these V-Ray Toolbars. To do that, we're going to go up to the Tools menu. We're going to go to the Toolbar Layout. So it's Tools, Toolbar Layout. And when we open the Toolbar Layout, there's a little File menu. We'll click on File and then Open. And we're going to go find on our flash drive those V-Ray Toolbars. So I have it right there. I'll go ahead and click on Open. And as soon as you click on Open, you're going to get the two V-Ray Toolbars that show up. And at that point, I can just go ahead and say OK. So once again, that was under Tools, Toolbar Layout. I go to the File menu, and I go to Open, and I go find that V-Ray Toolbar that I asked you all to save. So it's a little bit of an annoying little extra step that you have to do. The V-Ray tools are all available under the V-Ray menu and by command line. So if you know the commands for it, you can do it that way. But I would still recommend loading the toolbars. It's good practice to get into because it's easier just to pick them from the toolbars themselves. Yeah?
Can you go through it one more time?
Sure. So once again, it's under Tools, Toolbar Layout. It's about halfway down. Once you open the Rhino options in the Toolbars submenu, you'll go to the File menu. And then you'll go to Open and find your V-Ray Toolbars on your flash drive. OK, so now I have my, my V-Ray Toolbars loaded, which is good. And for our purposes today, we're going to start with some generic objects that you're going to create. We're going to kind of build up a little scene, and then we're going to do some renderings of that scene. Ultimately, we'll end up opening the project file that we worked on last class, and we'll do some materials on that. So that's kind of the trajectory of where we're going. But a lot of today is really just understanding what's going on in V-Ray and how do we work with V-Ray. So the first part is I want you to create what I call a simple composition of 5 objects. So we're talking like a cube and a sphere and a variety of different objects. The objects that you choose are completely up to you. I'll start with the basic primitives over here. In this case, it's a box corner to corner with a height. So I could, for example, create a box. Nice. If I want these to be filled in a little bit, I can switch from my wireframe view into my shaded view so that we can see it. There it is. We'll just go ahead and make perspective the active viewport. Underneath here, I don't know, let's do a cylinder. I don't know, everybody likes a donut. Let's do a donut. Why not? Sorry, I wanted mine to be a little bit bigger. Sure, we can do a pyramid too. So like I said, 5 objects. I want these 5 objects to be fairly close to each other. They don't actually need to intersect. They just need to be close to one another. And when I end up doing some renderings, I'd like a kind of a nice view of my objects, something like this, so that I can kind of work with these objects and see what's happening as I apply different materials to them. So let's move this donut a little bit closer. Not quite that close, something like that. There we go. So again, 5 objects, which is fine. I'm going to do a couple things that aren't on the handout, but I'm going to walk you through doing them anyway. The first thing that I'm going to do is save the scene. So I'm going to get it to look the way I want it to look. and then I'll come up to this little triangle on the perspective view, and I'm going to go to where it says Set View, and I'll go all the way down to Named Views. And this is something you get in the habit of doing whenever you do a render. You save the view so that when you make changes, you can go back to the same view and re-render, as opposed to having to manually figure out what the view is. It doesn't matter so much with these objects because you could get this view rather easily. But when you're doing your final project and you're doing a big render, once you have that perfect view that's composed correctly, the last thing you want to do is lose that view and not come back to it when you do another render. Because you're going to do iterative renders. Change this, change the lighting a little bit, change that material just a little bit until you get it just right. So I'm going to go ahead and go to that Named Views. It brings up the Named Views little dialog box here. I'm going to click the Save Disk. It's going to ask me to name it. I'll call it Perspective 1. So I just added a 0, 1 there. As a side tip, stay away from any spaces in the names. It'll help you later on. But it doesn't matter. You can put them in, but down the road, you'll end up learning that you shouldn't. So stay away from spaces. And now I have Perspective 1. The advantage here is if I move the view and I did something, I can come back to Set View. Perspective 1 is down here at the bottom, and it'll always set me back to that view. It's the same thing in SketchUp when you set up a scene. Same concept. So I have that set up for me. Now, before I can continue on, I need a couple things to actually be able to do the rendering. So I have my objects. Right now, I have no ground and no sky. I need there to be a ground. And in order to do that, instead of actually building a ground, V-Ray has something called an infinite plane that I can put into the scene. And what that is a plane that goes off into all directions, off to the horizon, essentially. And it's a specific object that's made by V-Ray for Rhino. It's available in the V-Ray Toolbars. It's right here after the two blue circles. Add V-Ray Infinite Plane. If you want to type in the command, it's viz infinite plane. So VIS infinite plane. And you can see that as soon as I drop that in, I get this plane that goes off to where the horizon line should be. If I were to zoom out and look at this, we'd see it's just a large rectangle. This rectangle is just an approximation of the infinite plane. It actually does go infinite. It's just this is representative of it. So let me go back to my Perspective 1 view. I'll go to Set View and Perspective 1, and now I'm seeing it. So I have my ground established. The sky we still need to deal with, but we're going to deal with that in V-Ray, not in the there's no sky infinite plane or anything. So we'll deal with that in a second. And the last thing that I need is I need a light. And we will ultimately get to where we install an environment where we have the sunlight, we set a specific location, we set a time of day, and all of that. For our purposes right now, we're creating an artificial light that's not as strong that will give us a reasonably quality rendering. So we're simplifying things just a little bit. The type of light that we're going to install is called a directional light. It's available in the tutorials under Rhino 5.17. So if you have the book or you're looking online, all of the stuff that I've been doing is available here under tutorials. If you went to either Rhino or V-Ray, so we would go to Rhino 5.17, there's the directional light. So when we create the directional light, the easiest way of dealing with the directional light is to give ourselves a little object to work with. And so I encourage people to do this. It's a little different than how I wrote it in the book, though. I do it without creating this. But for our purposes, if you give yourself a box, something like this, and you use this corner of the box and that corner of the box, it's really easy to set up the light. So I need to create the directional light. The current version of the V-Ray Toolbars has a magical hidden button on it that is the directional light. Again, something I have no control over. At the end of all these lights, the last one is create directional light, but there isn't an icon on it. So just mouse over and it's there. You just don't see an icon. Love it, right? And when I click on that, it asks me first for end of light direction vector. So where does it end? I'm going to pick this lower corner. Let me turn on my object snaps, turn on my end snap, and I'll snap to that lower corner. Start of light direction vector, we'll pick the opposite corner right there. So by giving myself this box, it was really easy to create the direction from corner to corner of my light. If I didn't do it that way and I just went into my light, I'd say, oh, there's the end, and I want it to be up high, but I have no way of getting it up. It's going to always end up on the ground plane, like that. And so then after the fact, I'd have to go in and do like a rotate 3D on this, or I could use the Gumball and get it to come up in space. It's too difficult. So save yourself the time, create the box, do the lower corner to the upper corner, and it'll create that line for you. You don't have to do opposite corners. I could, for example, do this corner and then that corner and have the light coming down. That's fine too. We do only want one light. So I have my one light here. When I'm done, I'll delete that box so it goes away. The directional light isn't a spotlight. It has no bearing on how long it is from the end vector to the it's as if you have an infinite number of lights in a sheet all shining down at once, parallel to each other. That's what a directional light's doing. So I have some directional light installed in the scene. That's good. The next part of this is it's time to actually enter V-Ray and work a little bit in V-Ray. So I'm going to introduce V-Ray options. I'm going to talk through a bunch of stuff and what they mean. I'll try to distill it down to the most important stuff, but there's a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and open the V-Ray options dialog box. On the V-Ray toolbars, it's the little tag-like item with an O on it for V-Ray options. You can also go to V-Ray and choose options, either one. And so the V-Ray option editor comes up, and it looks like this. And it doesn't look too bad, right? Not too bad. Yeah. So all of these are drawers that open. And so if I started to open these drawers and had them all open, I'm only right there is halfway. Look at all the options that are in V-Ray. Okay? So it's very overwhelming that there is so much stuff going on in V-Ray. But that's part of how you get really good quality renderings, is you've got to have all these options that are available to you because they all mean something. So I'm going to keep the drawers closed for the most part, and then only open them when I want. And that's why they set it up this way in the first place. So go ahead and click on the Global Switches drawer first. And so when the Global Switches drawer opens here, we have these are kind of major toggles on and off, major things. So we'll scoot down first. The geometry is fine by default, and actually all of this is fine by default, but I like to at least walk through it a little bit. Under lighting, we want to make sure that our lights are turned on. So there's a check mark. It is actually going to render the lights. That's a good thing. We have the ability to turn on hidden lights. So if you had a light that was on a layer, the layer was turned off, you could have the light on anyway, even if the layer was off. I don't recommend having that turned on because controlling a light by turning the layer on and off is a good thing, especially when we get to more complicated renderings. We also want to make sure that our shadows are showing. That's good. And this other box here for show GI only, this would be give me just general global illumination of my object. Nothing specific, just general lighting. So if you were doing a rendering and something wasn't working, sometimes you might turn on just your global illumination, just the background ambient light, as a way of testing settings. OK, so we'll come down here. Low thread priority is checked. That's a good thing. That helps a little bit on our rendering budget, our computer CPU power. As we come over on the right side, we do want our materials on. We want our reflections and our refractions to be turned on. If we uncheck that, we can simplify the rendering a little bit and do a test render. Sometimes that's useful. Just by turning off those reflections, it makes the rendering go a lot faster. We'll continue all the way down here. The rest of these all on. We'll talk about what maps mean a little bit later on and why they're important. And we'll leave our secondary ray bias at 0.001. That doesn't have to mean anything to you. Don't worry about it. Okay? So again, all of the defaults were pretty much OK. As I continue on down, under System here, this is where, and I'll come back to this when it matters. For our purposes today, the renderings that we're doing do not need distributed rendering at all. We will get to a point where you need to harness other computers to do your renderings. And I've worked very hard with the computer department to allow us to have distributed rendering. They don't want to do it. They tried to tell me last semester that it was, what was it? It was a malware, and that they wouldn't install it on the school computers. I'm like, no, it's not malware. It's something we use every day in this class. Like, it's not. But anyway, it is there. You guys have probably seen it before. It pops up when you first start the computer. It's called the XML Drs Spawner. Please leave it open in this little pop-up. And if you have friends, tell them to leave it open too. Because this is like karma points. That's how I always look at it. You're working and you're typing your history paper or your English paper. Let somebody borrow a little bit of your CPU power or your GPU power, because you don't need it. Let them get a little bit of rendering out. And you can actually hear it in this lab. Like if I was in here and nobody was in here, and I had the computers on and the spawners were open and I started a network render, you can hear all the fans on all the computers kick up when you start the render. And it makes a big difference. Question?
I don't have it open, so how can I get it?
You can do a search down here for XML Drs. Oops. And it should be there, Launch Distributed Rendering Spawner. If you accidentally close it, it's not the end of the world. Doesn't mean that you can't access it and can't render it. It just means that nobody else can borrow your computer during the rendering process. So the other thing that I've requested, and I believe is happening this semester, is that the computers department is building a special render farm server for us that'll be installed, that we'll have access to, that has like 20 cores in it to do rendering specifically for us. So if that happens, which fingers crossed it does, that will be awesome. And it'll speed up our rendering. These are the kinds of things that speed up renderings very dramatically. You go from taking 3 hours to 10 minutes. So it's a big difference. To turn it on, we would, here in distributed rendering, we'd have to turn it on. I'm not asking you to do it today because what we're rendering doesn't require distributed rendering. It'll actually take a little bit longer if you turn it on today because what we're doing is rather simple. So it is there, and it's under system. So the other thing that you'll notice, occasionally V-Ray will gray out. It has little glitches. Usually it comes back. It just did it for me. So I'll point that out the next time it happens again. So we'll continue on down. Next one is camera. We're going to ultimately be turning on something called the physical camera to deal with the exposure settings. For today's purposes, we're not going to worry about it. But I'm just showing you these things so you're kind of aware what's going on as we go through. Next one is a big one. We're actually going to make some changes today. That is environment. So click on the environment tab, and we have a couple different things. We have something called a GI Skylight, which is our global illumination or our reflected light of the sky itself. We will ultimately be installing like clouds and whatever in this, but for our purposes today, we want to make sure that it's set for white, and that'll work. You could set it to a light blue, but it's not going to make much difference for our purposes. We can leave it as white light for today. Below that, we have something called our reflection or refraction background. This is not the light that's being cast by the global illumination. It's not the reflected light. It's what we see. It's the image of what we see. So ultimately, that will also look like sky, and it'll be tied to our sun, or it'll be tied to our high dynamic range image. That is our background image. We'll deal with getting that there. If I leave it as black, however, when we do a rendering today, the sky will be black. Not so ideal. So we're going to change that color from black. I'll go ahead and click on it, and we can simply do a white. That's fine. This is like those I'm a Mac, I'm a PC commercials way back when, where the background's just white. Same concept. We just make everything white. If you wanted to do it a light blue, you could come down and find a light blue somewhere in here or create it. That's fine. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to leave it as white, and I'll say OK. OK, so we've made it through the first 4 drawers. You see that there's a bunch of other drawers. I'm not going to worry about any of those drawers other than output for right now, for today's purposes. I'm going to click on output, and right here, we're going to choose what our viewport size would be. For rendering, it's independent of what you actually see on the screen. So we could render a view that isn't what's on the screen if we wanted to. I think it's a lot easier to do it where what you see is what you get. So I'm going to click this Get View Aspect button at the bottom, and it's going to adjust my rendering to match what I'm seeing on my screen right now. And that'll be nice for a rendering. We want our width and height to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 600, 800-ish. We don't need much more than that. So I have that set up. I'll go ahead and close the output drawer again. And now the bulk of my options are set and ready to do some rendering. I'm going to go ahead and close the V-Ray options, and I'm going to do my first test render of what's happening. A couple things. One, my donut ended up being a little bit too low. It's being cut off by the ground plane. I want to move that up a little bit before I start the rendering. So I'll use one of the side views, and I can actually just drag it up. A little bit can be. There we go. So I have that composition ready. It's now time to do that first test rendering to see if it shows up. I will initiate the render by clicking the blue sphere with the R in it. And we should get a rendering. So we can see in this that everything's white. All our materials are default white. The sky is white. And there's a little bit of shadowing that's occurring. So I know that the light's working, and I know that my render's there, but I haven't actually assigned any materials yet. So the next piece of today is learning about materials and actually assigning materials to our objects. So this is my first render. You don't have to save the first one, but as we go forward, we're going to end up saving renderings so that we have things to post later on today. OK, so now it's time to assign just a basic material. I'm going to go ahead, and this is V-Ray 8.3 basic materials, but I'm going to do it live for you as well. I'm going to go into my V-Ray materials by clicking on the yellow sphere with the M on it. And this is my V-Ray material editor. When this opens, it ends up in the upper left corner. Click and drag it and move it away from the left corner just in case V-Ray happens to freeze. It gives you access to your Rhino menu without V-Ray freezing. So just move it over. And what we're seeing here is in the V-Ray material editor is this X would be a preview of a selected material. I have no materials, so I have no previews yet. And we have a top hierarchy in the tree that says scene materials. And again, I have no actual materials just yet. So I could create a material by right-clicking on scene materials and say create material standard. Don't worry about what these other materials are. We're just working with standard. And when I do that, I now have a material called default material. I could go ahead and preview that default material. Oh, it's gray. All right. And I could actually assign that to my objects. So let me select each object. I'll hold down Shift. And I'll assign each of those 5 objects to the default material. So I'll right-click on default material and say apply material to selection. There are 2 ways of applying material. One is by layer and one is by object or by selection. For today's purposes, we're just going to be applying by selection. We're not worried about layers. I didn't even open the layers window at all for what we were doing today. So I'm going to go ahead and apply material to selection. Now all of these objects are that gray. And if I went back to the rendering, we would now actually see the first round of my objects. So I have my gray objects against their white background. I'm getting some shadow from my lights. That's good. We see a little bit of shadow there. Perfect. This is my base level rendering before I've started much. I'm going to go ahead and save this as my first render. I'm going to click the single disk icon. And I'll go to my flash drive for today. And I need to create a folder for today. This is fall of 2018. And I'm just going to number these. This is 01. And there it is. The next thing that I want to do is in the V-Ray material editor, I want to actually create materials with some colors. So it's not just the basic gray. We're going to assign some colors. I'm going to create 5 materials now. Come over here. The default is gray. Let me just create some new materials. I'll right-click on Scene Material. I'm going to go to Create Material Standard. This new material I'm going to make red. So let's first rename it. I'll double-click on the name, and I can call it red instead. And again, it's always a good idea to rename your materials, because if you don't rename them, you'll have default material 1 through 10, and you're not going to remember which one was concrete and which one was something else. So name your materials ahead of time. So there's red. If I were to preview it, it's not red. That's a problem. So just like with the rest of V-Ray, this is set up with drawers. Some of the drawers are already open, but this particular material, red, has 3 drawers. It has the diffuse drawer, it has an options drawer, and it has a maps drawer. For today's purposes, we're concentrating on the diffuse drawer. I'll open that up. And I have a couple different options. The first option is something called color. And I have a gray square. Well, it should be pretty obvious that that gray matches this gray, so that's the color. So let's change that color. I'll click on the gray square. It'll open up a select color, and I'll pick red instead. We can pick a little bit darker red, sure. And I'll say OK. Now that's red. If I click on Preview, we'd get red instead of gray. It's a good sign. Stay away, by the way, from this live preview. this can really get you into trouble because it can eat up too much system resources and cause Rhino and V-Ray to crash. So just leave it off. When you need to preview, just click the preview button. So I now have red. Let's make a few more. I'm going to right-click on Scene Materials. I'm going to go to Create Material, Standard. And this one's going to be a different color. And I'm not going to name it first because I'm not sure what color I'm going to make it. Let's make it turquoise. And I should probably, oh, of course I picked turquoise, like I know how to spell turquoise. Maybe, whatever. I might have spelled it wrong. OK, so let's create a few more. I can preview it. Nice. Right-click, Create Material, Standard. Let's come down here. Oh, let's do a nice pink material. Why not? This is magenta. I can preview it. Yep, there it is. Create Material, Standard. And we'll change this one. Sure, we can do a gold, yellow. Just call it yellow. And there it is. I have 1, 2, 3, 4. I need one more. And let's see here. We haven't done a blue. We'll do a blue. Perfect. So I've now created blue, magenta, red, turquoise, and yellow. I need to have each of these objects assigned to one of those materials. Do I only have 4 objects? That's a problem. Let's see here. Let's add another box in the back here. Yep, sorry about that. We needed another box. So now I'm going to start to actually assign the materials to the objects. So I'll pick this pyramid first. I'll go back to my material editor, and we'll go ahead and assign it to blue. I'm going to have it selected, right-click on blue, and say Apply Material to Selection. So I've applied it, but nothing changed in this view. I can't tell that I have blue assigned to it. If I want to preview what I'm seeing, I can go to the perspective little triangle here and switch from shaded to rendered, and it'll give me a preview of what I'm seeing. This preview is not accurate. It doesn't mean that's what it's going to look like at all. Sometimes it looks way too dark or way too light, or sometimes you can't even see the materials. It's just a preview. So it can be helpful right now because we're applying materials. You can see which one is assigned to what. Let's apply material to selection. There's magenta. Apply material to selection. There's my red. Apply material to selection. There we go. And the last one, apply material to selection. So I now have assigned all of those to their basic materials. And I can go ahead and perform a new rendering. So let me go ahead and click on the render button. It's not popping up because it's minimized down here. So we need to bring it and make it big. And there's my first rendering that has my various materials that have been applied to it. You can see that the shadow is being cast there. We're seeing the shadows. That's a good sign. That's how it should be. I'm going to go ahead and save this right now. And we'll save it as number 2. There we go. So the next thing that I ask you to do in the handout is we're going to adjust the reflection. Sorry, we're going to adjust the transparency of 2 of the materials. So at this point, the materials have already been applied. So when I make changes to the material, it's automatically going to go onto the objects. So I don't actually have to do any assigning of materials anymore. Yeah? Yes. If I'm in the rendered view like right now, I can't because I can't see that light. I have to actually switch back into my shaded. There's the directional light. If you don't like the directional light, we can, a lot of times it's easiest to do it in the top view. I could do a rotate. So under transform and then rotate, choose the point around which you want to rotate, whatever it is, and I could rotate it that way. I could raise it higher by doing a rotate in one of my side views. Alternatively, there's a tool called the Gumball that is not my favorite tool. I have a love-hate relationship with it. It's really good for certain things, so I hesitate to even tell you about it. But it is here. it gives you a little kind of an interactive way of adjusting your object. So if I wanted to rotate it here in perspective, I could rotate it around that. Likewise, if I wanted to rotate up, I could rotate it up. So sometimes that's a useful way of dealing with it. For me, it can cause more trouble than it's worth sometimes. So I generally don't leave it on. Some of you will find that you absolutely love it and you have to have it. But we'll get to that point when you actually need it. So that's how you would adjust it after the fact. Remember, that's not something that you could see when you're in the rendered view, because that goes away. Lines, curves, all of that goes away too in the rendered view. All you're seeing is the planes and their materials in the rendered view. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my V-Ray material live editor. There it is. And I want to adjust some of the transparency. So let's pick an object that's in the front. Let's pick the purple, for example. I'll go to the magenta, and I want to adjust the transparency. The transparency adjustment is available in the same diffuse drawer as the color, but it's on the other side. So we have color is set as magenta, then we have transparency is set as black. The amount of transparency is determined by a grayscale from black to white. 100% transparent is white, 100% opaque is black, 50% gray is right in the middle. So if I click on transparency where it's black, and I change from black to dark gray, for example, I can say, OK. When I go to preview it, you're going to see that it becomes semi-transparent. I'm seeing slightly through this object. So that's good. We can see a kind of a live preview there. I'll pick the turquoise next, and I'm going to adjust the transparency. But this time, instead of dark gray, I'm going to go to gray. And I'll say OK. And now when I hit preview, you'll see that I'm seeing much more through the object. So notice I only made it to gray. That's at about 50%. If I were to pick the transparency and choose something like light gray, I might not see much of the object at all. It's there, but it's very faint. So for right now, I would stick with gray or dark gray as your transparency value, because you're going to see a little bit more of the color. So there it is. I've done it for the magenta, and I've done it for the turquoise. And that's good. Time to go ahead and do a rendering and see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and click on the render button. And you'll notice that now suddenly the rendering takes a little bit longer, because V-Ray has to calculate the transparency. So we're seeing through an object, and as I'm seeing through it, I should see all of the shadow being cast on this object. The shadow is a little bit lighter than it was before, because it's now a transparent object, so some of the light's coming through. Likewise, I'm seeing through this magenta, through the turquoise, back to the yellow, and I'm seeing all of those. So it's calculating, so it's going to take a little bit longer. I'll go ahead and save this as well. And we'll save it as number 3. There we go. And now it's time to start adding some reflection to layers. So I have a tutorial for that. It's 8.4. We're going to add reflection to 4 of the 5 layers. I'm going to go ahead and click on my material editor, so the M again. And now I'm going to add some reflections. So we'll start with the blue, and I want to add some reflections. I add the reflections by right-clicking on blue and saying Create Layer, Reflection. So one more time, that would be right-click on blue, Create Layer, Reflection. And you see that when I do that, it adds a reflection layer to my material. So there's the reflection layer. We'll leave the default values just fine. And I'll move on. And if I were to preview it, that went from a non-reflective object to something that has a little shine to it. I'm going to go through and do it for some of these other objects. We'll add a reflection to the magenta. Let's see here. Create Layer, Reflection. We'll add one to the red, right, Create Layer, Reflection. And we'll add one to the turquoise, right, Create Layer, Reflection. So we've just added it for all of these. We can always preview any one of these to make sure that it's showing up the way you want it to. Perfect. I'll close my V-Ray material editor now that I've added those reflection layers, and we'll do another render. And once again, it's going to take even longer this time to do the rendering. You'll notice that the colors get a little bit more muted once they have reflections because they're reflecting a white sky. So we've got white sky, we've got white ground. The colors are going to be a little bit white because of that reflection. If we had clouds, we'd see a lot more of the reflection. We'd see the clouds and that sort of thing. But that's past where we are right now. But you can tell already that the objects have become reflective, which is the point. They become shiny. I'm going to go ahead and save this one as my number 4. And I'll click Save. There it is. So we're going to change how reflective these materials are. And notice, by the way, that we put the reflection on, but it really the preview looks nothing like the final rendering. Right? You can see it's departing further and further away. So you can never trust that preview completely. In fact, I could just switch this back to shaded because it doesn't matter anymore. What I'm seeing is not what I'm getting. I'm going to go back to my V-Ray material editor, and I want to play around with how reflective a particular material is. So let me start with the blue material. We can see a preview of what it is. Over here under reflection, I have a couple different values that I can adjust. We're going to adjust the index of refraction, or the IOR, of the material. I'm going to do that by clicking the capital M next to where it says reflection. And when I do that, there's a value of IOR, and it's currently set for 1.55. If I increase this value, the object becomes shinier. If I decrease the value, the object becomes less shiny. This is something that's a known thing. So if you were trying to create a material that was a shiny material, you could actually do a Google search for IOR of diamond, for example. And we'd have to look around. Here we go. Here's a different. The index of refraction of beer, for example, is 1.345. So the point is that these are known values. So if you were trying to create a specific material, so in my case a diamond, there it is, it would be 2.418 would be the index of refraction. So I'm going to go ahead and use that value for this. So this is 2.418, and you can see it's different depending on what it is that you're working on. And I'll put that right here in the IOR. What was it? 418? Whatever. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And now if I were to preview it, we'll see that we're getting a lot more shine out of that particular object. So for the rest of these, it doesn't really matter. It's not like we're trying to recreate something specific. But you could change this value and see what happens. So here on this magenta one, let's change it much higher. Let's go to like 4.5. We'll say OK. And when I preview it, we can see that it's really reflective. On the turquoise, maybe our reflection here isn't so high, and it's 1.0. We can see that we got a little bit of reflection, but not too much. And on the red one, actually the red one's a better one for 1.0. There's my preview. Let's make it a little higher. It's not enough. There we go. We got just a little bit on that one. And on the turquoise, let me go back, and we're going to change that one. I don't know. We'll do 2.0. And there it is. Now I'll go ahead and do a rendering again. So the rendering load, though, just got a whole lot more complicated. And so again, rendering is going to slow down because now it has to calculate what the reflection of one is on the other, and backwards and forwards. So the rendering is going to be a lot slower as it goes through and does this calculation. So for example, on this red donut here, you see how we're getting reflection of the yellow behind. But we're also getting reflection of the red donut and the yellow being bounced off of some of the other objects. V-Ray works to 16 light bounces. So if we imagined light coming down, hitting this purple, bouncing up and hitting the turquoise behind, going through the turquoise, hitting the yellow, coming back and bouncing off the yellow and hitting the red, you get the idea. So up to 16 times. So it takes a while to go through and calculate, but that's part of why it looks realistic when you finish the rendering. So I'll go ahead and save this. This is my number 5. And I'll click Save. There we go. And now it's going to be time to play around with a few other values in the world of reflection. I'm going to click on my V-Ray material editor again. And we have a couple other things that we can adjust. So here under blue, I can change under glossiness. I can change the highlight glossiness. So for example, if I change this to 2.0, you'll see that when I preview it, it becomes a little bit stronger. Let me change it. Let me see if I can. Not going to let me do it. Let me go 0.75. Maybe it'll only let me go down. Yeah, there you go. It diffuses it out a little bit. It's not quite as sharp of a reflection. So I can go to 0.5, for example, and it's not as sharp of a reflection. It's more like a plastic when it reflects than it is a really shiny object. Let me go to the red here. Trying to think if there's anything else I want to do. Let's preview it. Yeah, I don't really want this one to go down. It's not letting me go up. Let me try making this one go up. No, it's limiting me there. Yeah, OK. So I just upped the reflection power by 1 just to see. And we'll go ahead and do another rendering. And this time the blue won't be as reflective. It'll be a little bit more muted. And we'll let that finish. So in this instance, I've gone through and I've played with the materials. You now should have a better understanding about the general principles about how materials work in terms of being able to change color, being able to change reflection or glossiness. The same thing applies to all the materials that you might load. If you want your asphalt to be shiny, you could change your asphalt to be a little bit shinier, understanding how you would add the reflection. You wanted it to look wet, for example. OK, so I'm saving this. This was my number 6. And now that I made it through the basic materials, it's time to actually load in some real materials instead of creating my own. Now, all the materials that we're going to load in to V-Ray, somebody created at some point. A lot of them I created. Some of them were default materials. Some of them other people created. They all take time to kind of get right. The best renderings out there are the ones that use materials that are really realistic. And so a good realistic material is hard to come by. So all the settings matter. Let's go ahead and find, back at the beginning of class, I asked you to download that V-Ray material archive here. If I show it in my folder, there it is, V-Ray materials. I want to extract this. And when it's done extracting, I'm not quite sure why I need a speed graph on the extraction, but OK. I'll have a folder for V-Ray materials. And inside of that, I have a bunch of materials. You're going to want to copy this V-Ray materials folder onto your flash drive. For me personally, I have it on in my resources folder. So I have my OneDrive, and then I have a folder called resources, and then I have something called V-Ray. And inside of that is where I have my V-Ray materials. I have a few other things because I make materials and I end up zipping them up and whatever. We'll also end up having HDRI background images and VisOp files. We'll get to what those mean a little bit later on. But for right now, you should have something called V-Ray materials. Here it is. And inside of the V-Ray materials folder are a bunch of V-Ray materials. Now, a V-Ray material, let me open up a concrete, for example, has a lot of different stuff happening. So generally, if you opened up the material, you'd have a preview. In this case, I have 2 different previews of it. You would also have a kind of 3 files that make up what that material is. All of these files are important toward making your true V-Ray rendered material. So you can't just load the VisOpt file. You can't just copy this one, for example, and use that. You need the rest of this to make up the material. So it's more than just a single file. So make sure you save the whole zip file with all the contents as part of it. And we'll talk through this a little bit more. But for now, when we use these materials, just make sure everything is there. The other part about V-Ray materials that we're going to get to in a second is when I load materials, it's going to tie the drive letter of my drive, whatever that, you plug in your drive and it's called the D drive or the I drive or whatever. It's a Windows thing. It's going to tie my material to that drive letter. And so you want to make sure that you're very consistent about always having the same drive letter when you're working on your files. So pay attention to which USB port you plug your hard drive into or your flash drive into, and when you sit down at your computer, make sure you always plug it into that same port. It tends to eliminate a lot of the issues. So now it's time to load in some of those materials. I'm going to go to my V-Ray material editor again. There it is. And I want to load a material instead of create a material this time. So I'll right-click on Scene Materials. I'm going to go to Load Material. And when I do that, I need to go to my flash drive. Sorry. There it is. I'm going to go into my Resources folder, into V-Ray, into my V-Ray materials, and here are all of my materials. So I was just picking on concrete. I'll pick on concrete right now. I'm going to do the dark concrete. Again, when you guys are picking these, pick whatever you want. More than half of you are going to try to pick glass. I know that. You always do. Glass isn't going to render right today. I promise. The thing about glass, everybody wants it, but glass works because it reflects the surroundings. You don't have enough surroundings to reflect, so it's not worth it yet. It doesn't have sky. If you look at glass, just look at any of these pieces of glass, you see reflections. We look at the glass in that window, you see the trees, you see the sky, you see all of that stuff. That's what tells our brain it's glass. You don't have trees and stuff to reflect in this image, so it's not going to look right. So you can load it and you can try it, but it's not going to look right. I'll just warn you that ahead of time. So I'm going to go ahead and load the concrete. I'll go ahead and say open. And when I do that, it shows up as concrete dark. We should see a preview of it. That looks good. Let me go ahead and assign it to this object. I'll right click and say apply material to selection. Now that object is concrete. I can see it by going into my rendered view, and we can say, yeah, it looks like concrete's applied. I'm going to load in some other materials. I'll right click and say load material. We just did a concrete, so let's do something else here. Trying to think. We could do... No, I don't feel like those. Let's do brick. Sure. Let's do a new clean brick. There's the brick. I'll right click and I'll apply it to the, come on. There. I'll right click, apply material to selection. Now it has brick applied to it. The donut needs to be a different material. Let's go ahead and load material. And let's see, what should donut be? We can make a wood donut. Why not? So I'll apply. There's my wood. I can right click and say apply material to selection. Now you can see that it's wood. And again, the previews are only approximates. So I'll right click and say load material. And let's see, what else can I pick? We can do a porcelain. Let's do an orange porcelain. We can preview it. There it is. And we could apply that to this back. And load material. And really, have fun. Load whatever materials sound fun to you. Oh, I don't know. What else could I do? I'm going to do the grass with flowers. Stay away, by the way. Don't do bunch grass yet. And the grassy hill, you won't be satisfied. If you want something that's kind of fuzzy, you can do grass with flowers. That'll work for you. And we'll apply that on this. And there's the grass. OK, so now that I've applied that, we can go ahead and do a rendering. And there you go. So now I've actually assigned some materials to it. Again, you can pick whatever materials you want, and you can go ahead and save that rendering for later. And this would be number 7, what we're doing today. OK, so at this point, you're free to play around with your materials. What I want you to also do is open up your exercise 203 file, your house file, and I want you to apply materials to that and play around with the process. One thing that you'll notice on these is that the materials don't always quite look right. So if I looked at the brick, for example, it's a little squished compared to what it should look like. We're going to correct that using something called texture mapping and determining how a material is applied to an object. I'm not worried today that it looks a little squished. We'll solve that problem later on. So don't worry about that. I would say it's probably 3 classes from now we'll do texture mapping. And you guys will learn about how to make it look right. But really have a good time, play around with this. It's meant to be fun. And it's also meant for you to kind of experiment with what kinds of materials are available. Zoom in, do a rendering, see what it looks like. Let's look at what the grass looks like here. Zoom out a little bit. That's the point. Obviously, the closer in the renderings occur, the longer it takes. This particular rendering has some spikes in it, so it's got to calculate out all those little spikes, and it's going to take a little while for it to do that. So, like I said, play around with it, have fun with it. My guess is that you'll finish a little bit early today. That's OK. Spend your time, work on another class, get some extra work done, get caught up if you're behind. If you haven't finished everything yet, spend some time doing that as well. Next class, I'm going to give you a little bit more of a prescriptive. We're going to make some fancy geometry. I'm going to show you step by step how to do it. We'll spend a lot of time dealing with chamfers and how do you solve problems when geometry intersects in a funny way, and how do we fix that. So we'll go through all of that kind of stuff next class. I don't think you guys probably don't have any questions about anything. There's no assignments pending or anything. So just do this and come back next class, and we'll be good to go.